ההרצאה האחרונה בישיבה הזאת של פרופסור יששכר אשטר סאשה, באוניברסיטת לונדון, University College לונדון, לוח השנה המעבר מראיית הירח לחישוב המולד. באנגלית הכותרת היא The Calendar Transition from Moon Sighting to Calculation of the Molad.
Thank you. And this talk has a subtitle, 4 stages.
Wasn't here.
4 stages in the development of the Jewish calendar. These 4 stages is a new idea which I just thought about last week, which is why it's not in the program, but I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to present this paper, because it has forced me to think a bit more about this subject and actually has led to this idea of 4 stages, for whatever it's worth. Now, everyone knows that originally the calendar, as described in the Mishnah, was based on new moon sightings, and the Bet Din would decide when every month would begin. And then, much later, we have a fixed calendar, which is a calendar which is in use today. The question has always been, how did the transition occur from one to the other? The traditional view is that Hillel II instituted the fixed calendar in the year 359, but in the 19th century, and all the more so after the discovery of the Cairo Gniza, it became very evident to scholars that the fixed calendar that we have today was in fact instituted much later, and the date I would say for this is the early 9th century. This raises the question of the development that took place between the Mishnaic period and the 9th century. Earlier scholars, Bornstein and in particular Yaffe, wrote a lot about this. Yaffe wrote a whole book about this, Korot Cheshbon HaIbur, in which he drew grand historical conclusions from mathematical inferences based on limited and not always relevant evidence. And no one, I think, has ever been convinced by his narrative. I have been working on this subject for 20 years, and I must say that it's only in the last 5 years that I'm beginning to feel that there is a bit of a breakthrough. Okay, so I've identified 4 stages. There's 1 page of handout for each of these stages. The first stage is the Tannaitic period, new moon sighting, and the Rabbinic Bet Din. It's important to understand that the legal narrative which is presented in Mishnah Rosh Hashanah is not historical. From a historical perspective, I would say that yes, the calendar in this period, in the Mishnaic period, was lunar, the Jewish calendar was lunar. Yes, it was based on new moon sightings, although I can't tell you how often such sightings were made. But it was probably not, or not always, the Bet Din that made these decisions. I have evidence that city councils in Palestine very often made calendar decisions, Jewish calendar decisions, and in the diaspora communities made their own decisions. And as a result, there wasn't a single unified calendar governed by the Bet Din, but different Jewish communities did different things. But in any event, rabbinic literature, which is what we're focusing on in this conference, does consider the narrative to be historical, but also as we go beyond the Mishnaic period, there is very clearly a sense in rabbinic literature of historical changes which are taking place. I'm not going to discuss at length the Mishnaic system, which I think is probably well known to many of us here, but what I would like to point out is the judicial character of the rabbinic new moon procedure, something which has not always been noted. But it's very interesting that the decisions which are made about the new moon, according to Mishnah, have to be taken in a Bet Din, which is a judicial court. It has to be based on witnesses, witnesses is something judicial. And the scientific element involved in the procedure is absolutely minimal. If you look at the passage which is on your handout, so they ask the witnesses a few questions. כיצד ראית את הלבנה לפני החמה, לאחר החמה, לצפונה, לדרומה, כמה היה גבוה, לאן היה נוצר, כמה היה רחב. These questions are very basic questions and they are very vague, and scientifically speaking they don't have much value. The other point is that the verification of the witnesses follows a strictly judicial procedure, which is one of corroboration. So I'm reading again from the passage. אחר כך היו מכניסים את השני ובודקים אותו. נמצאו דבריהם מכוונים, עדותן קיימת. What makes the testimony of the witnesses acceptable or valid? If they corroborate one another. This is a judicial criterion, but not if they conform to scientific truth or if they are scientifically verified. There is in fact no scientific verification here, there is only a judicial procedure. Now why the new moon procedure in Mishnaic law is judicial is a subject which I've discussed elsewhere, but the main point we have to remember from this is that the procedure in the Mishnah is halachic, it is not scientific. The second stage, stage 2, is the Amoraic period, which I entitle calendar rules. It's a very significant change. The early Amoraic, I would say early Amoraic period, brings in very significant changes to the rabbinic calendar. And this is through the introduction of rules which are attributed to the early Amoraim and which you do not find in earlier sources. So going through the page on the handout, we have first of all the rule that Tishri lo nitaber or lo matzinu elul mubar. These are different versions of the same rule, but what it means is that Elul always has 29 days. The next rule is that Adar asamuch l'Nisan chaser, that Adar always has 29 days. The reason why Elul and Adar have to have 29 days and only 29 days is to reduce the risk of errors in the following month when it comes to the dates of the festivals. Then we have a passage in Megillah, Yerushalmi Megillah, Aleph Bet, in which we learn two things. Yes, Amar Rabbi Yosa Litkan Chaliot Shiba. I'm not going to explain the passage, it's a bit complicated, but basically we learn two points in this passage. First of all, that Yom Kippur, Tzom HaRabba, Yom Kippur cannot occur on a Sunday, and second of all, that Yom Kippur cannot occur on a Friday. Sorry, that's all one thing, yeah? Yom Kippur cannot be on a Sunday or on a Friday, a new rule. And the other thing we learn from this passage is that there is a fixed number of days between Purim and Yom Kippur, which implies probably the regular alternation of 29 and 30-day months between Purim all the way to Yom Kippur. So it's pretty much a fixed calendar at this point, really. The next passage, Yerushalmi Sukkah, tells us yet another rule that Hoshana Rabbah can't occur on Shabbat. That's Arafta, the day of Arava, the day of the willow, cannot occur on Shabbat. And then finally we have a passage in the Bavli where Rav Huna bar Ravin sent a message to Rava giving him an instruction about how to figure out whether or not the year is intercalated with an Adar Sheni. Now, all these rules which are being introduced in the early Amoraic period have the effect of gradually fixing the calendar, because the more there are rules, the less there is flexibility. And new moon sightings must increasingly be ignored in order for the rules to be followed. And in connection with this, just one more detail from the passage in Yerushalmi Sukkah, Rabbi Simon Mefaked Leilen de Mechashvin, those who calculate. This is very interesting. Suddenly we have people who calculate the calendar and are no longer making decisions based on empirical evidence. This then is the Amoraic period. We now move to stage 3. Stage 3 is post-Amoraic, post-Talmudic. I call it Kaliric and early modern Gaonic. It takes us to the 8th century. This is a very significant period because I identify it as a period in which calendar cycles are introduced. The concept of cycle is a new cycle, and it makes its appearance in this period. Now, I have referred to you earlier to the tradition that Hillel instituted the calendar. It's a medieval tradition. The source of it, or the earliest source we have of it, is the Tshuva of Rav Haye Gaon, which is the first passage in section 3 of your handout. Ad Yomei Hillel ben Rabbi Yehuda Bishnat Tavresh Ein Nishtarot, etc. And if one reads this passage carefully, one sees that in fact he is not attributing to Hillel the institution of a calendar, or of the calendar. All he is saying is that Hillel instituted the 19-year cycle of intercalations. When he says, Ela achazu aseder hazeh asher ha'abi adam, I'm not giving you the whole passage, but there wouldn't have been any point in this, but if one reads the whole Tshuva, it is evident that he is only talking about the cycle of intercalations. And then in the later medieval period, the story about Hillel grew, and the Baal HaMaor and the Ramban attribute to Hillel the institution of the whole calendar. Okay, that's the story which sort of rolls on. Now, one would expect such a major institution to have been mentioned in the Talmud if it was dated to 359. It is not. And in fact, the 19-year cycle is not mentioned anywhere in early rabbinic literature, even though the concept of a 19-year cycle was well known in other ancient calendars, Mesopotamia and Greece, but it is not represented, I dare say, in fact, in any Jewish source. It's not in Qumran, you won't find it in any Jewish source until this period, which I call Kaliric and early Mid-Gaonic. The very first references one finds to calendar cycles in general are in the Piyutim, which are associated with the Kalir. And the first one which I want to draw your attention to, a passage which I actually discovered only just 2 years ago, and I don't think anyone has really paid attention to it or even read the manuscript properly. But Vayamim asher yirsar menum bashana yeshalem lo l-19 shana. Yes, this I think is the first explicit reference to a 19-year cycle in the whole of Hebrew and Jewish literature. In other passages, another krova, we have Molad Cheres Shemone ve'esrim, Molad Asar Echad ve'esrim. This is another cycle, it's a 21-year cycle. We see that the Kalir is interested in cycles and interested in calendar cycles. The Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is the first source in which we have a full description of the 19-year cycle, and at this stage one can say that the cycle has been fully established. Machzor ha'ibur 19 shana, and he divides it into Shiva machzorim ktanim, into 7 subgroups of 2 or 3 years. Shalosh Shtaim. Okay, this is the sequence. This is the first full-length description we have of the 19-year cycle. And then this appears again in a text which I've called a primitive rabbinic calendar. I found it in one Cairo Gniza fragment, which I wrote an article on in 2016. And in the meanwhile, I found another one in JTS, so that's another article which will come out later this year. But these primitive rabbinic calendars, there are more of them than one actually realizes, and they've been preserved in the Cairo Gniza. Let me just read this passage. Iba'et manda Macheshvan v'Kislev. If you want to know whether Macheshvan and Kislev, chasirin or kesidran or shlimim, whether they are defective, orderly or full, both 29 days, 29 or 30 days, or both 30 days. Chameh ba'aden simana. Have a look at this siman. Chakash, shach, shakash, chashach. Chashash is a good tongue twister, yeah? Chash, shach, Shiva machzorin inun, lo yutet shnin de machzora. Now, what's interesting about this, what I call a primitive rabbinic calendar, is that the 19-year cycle here doesn't only determine the intercalations, which years have an Adar Sheni, but actually determine the full calendar. Because you see, Chet in this siman, Chet stands for Chasirim, Kaf stands for Kesidran, Shin stands for Shlimim. Every year in the 19-year cycle has a predetermined character, and once you know that, you know the whole thing. And when you get to the end of the 19 years, you go back to the beginning again. So this is really a full cycle. It's a fixed calendar which doesn't require any calculation, not of the Molad nor of anything else. It's a very simple scheme. Now, this particular one that I'm quoting here is very inaccurate and would fall out of line with the moon very quickly. But the other primitive calendar, which I've discovered in the JTS fragment, NEA 1745, contains a similar cycle, but which is much more accurate, and which could have been used in practice for at least 100 years. And I would suggest, I don't have any historical proof of this, but I would suggest that, let's say in the 8th century, which is before the present-day calendar was instituted, but through the length of as much as a whole century, this primitive calendar could actually have been in use. And everything that we see here in the Kaliric and the early mid-Gaonic period is, I would also argue, in imitation of Christian Easter calendars. The whole idea of cycles and using cycles and dividing the calendar as a cycle is actually borrowed from the Christian Easter cycle. There are lots of similarities, specific similarities, which I can't go into detail now, between the Christian Easter cycles and these primitive rabbinic calendars, but in general terms, the Christian Easter calendars are based on a 19-year cycle with fixed dates which repeat themselves, and I think that the idea must have been taken from there. And then we move finally to stage 4. Stage 4 is a very revolutionary stage, is the institution of the calendar that we still have today, the Molad calendar. It is first attested in 823 in a treatise written by the Muslim scholar Al-Khwarizmi. Tzvi Langemann brought out a Hebrew translation of it. You've got the reference there on the page. And then by the early 10th century, it is clear that this calendar is completely established among Rabbinite Jewry. Again, I'm not going to go into detail with this calendar because some of you may know it already, but all I want to say is that the key feature of this new calendar is the Molad. The Molad is the time, the astronomical time of the new moon. It's the time of the conjunction, lunar-solar conjunction. I'm not going to define this in detail, but it is an astronomical point in time. It's a very precise time. And this is what determines, in this calendar, the beginning of the month. I've given you a passage from the letter of the Rosh HaGolah, the Exilarch, from a Cairo Gnida fragment, which was published a long time ago, but I had to republish it in 2001 because it was very faulty. But you see in the first line, this is really the critical line where my edition really made the difference. Mishum siara de Nisan, deka mitzlid beyamama detlata, etc. You see that the Rosh HaGolah is giving a time of the Molad, the time when the moon is born. This letter of the Exilarch is often quoted to prove that the fixed calendar was not yet in use in 835 because the dates that he gives are actually different from the dates that would be calculated according to our calendar. And this is absolutely true, But all I want to show you from this passage is the way in which the exilarch is at least using the Molad as the basis of the calendar, and this is the most significant change. Now, the Molad is a scientific value. It's based on an astronomical calculation of the lunar cycle. The data that are used for the Molad, the length of the Molad and so on, without explaining to you how the calculation works, but the data is drawn almost certainly from Ptolemy's Almagest, from Arabic translations of the Almagest, which were made at the very beginning of the 9th century. And Ptolemy himself drew this knowledge from Babylonian astronomy. So this is really cutting-edge scientific knowledge of the early 9th century in the Near East. The interesting thing about the Molad is that it was never used until then in any calendar, Jewish or non-Jewish, and that in fact the use of the Molad makes the Jewish calendar that we have today the most accurate fixed lunar calendar in the world. I don't know any other calendar, any other lunar calendar, calculated lunar calendar in the world, which has a level of precision of the Jewish one, and that is very simply because the Jewish one uses a scientific value for determining the beginning of the month. Now, the idea of using a scientific value is highly original, but not only is it original, it doesn't fit earlier rabbinic tradition, where, as we have seen in earlier periods, in the Mishnaic period and even later periods, only a very minimal use was ever made of scientific knowledge. So something very dramatic has happened here in the early 9th century, which I can't really explain. Conference about transitions, but I can't explain the transition. So why and how the Molad was turned or brought in and turned into the foundation of the calendar, for the moment has to remain an open question.